Hi folks, we're going to do another rendition of a little bit of the Architecture Extras, a series that I've been kind of throwing in and sneaking in to maybe supplement classes and trainings and pieces that we've talked about. Now, in previous iterations of these little sessions, we talked a little bit about the ServiceNow platform architecture and this whole table-driven architecture that we see up here on the screen, this idea that everything in ServiceNow is simply a record in a table, but those tables interact in a way that kind of get us to something. And then as we went forward with that understanding of the platform architecture, we built a little further and actually went and built a table on the global scope or the global platform. So in other words, we built a table in our case called airports. And it was based on the series of requirements that you see here. And as we built those requirements, we got the idea that in building a table, even on the global level, without getting into development tools or anything like that, when you build a table, you automatically are building components to that table. Things like a menu, which is a record in the menu table that lets you navigate to it. So in other words, something like this. And then to get to those menus, little pieces like modules, which are things like this, records in a module table, that would let you actually get to a table that is, in our case, our airports table over here. And then to maybe access that table to determine what fields and records and things you can see, then the system touches another table called the access control table. And as the system looks at that access control table for the table airports, it checks various things. Now, that gets us through quite a lot of building. When all we did was build a single table, it did a lot of the work for us. And the system presents us, as you might imagine, with forms and lists. But if we want that table to do more for us, then we need to start touching these other pieces. UI or user interface policy, client scripts, UI or user interface actions, and then business rules and data policies, and maybe more that we do with access controls. And to do all of these things, we need to have a slightly better understanding of JavaScript. Now, there are a dozen or more. There are hundreds of resources to learn JavaScript. In fact, sometimes the challenge is less learning JavaScript and more knowing where to go with all of the different classes that you can cover. But I will mention, in ServiceNow's community, there's a fantastic article by Shiva Thomas on the topic, JavaScript Learning Path from Zero to Hero. And that's a great resource. One of the other great resources that you might find helpful would be resources to learn JavaScript like Code Academy. But what I'm about to do over the next 5 minutes is not actually use ServiceNow at all, but just kind of talk at a super high level for people who maybe never done any coding before about JavaScript as an object-oriented scripting tool. And vaguely object-oriented. I'm not going to get into the very, very deep components of it because I wanted this to be something to address for people who are maybe new to doing any of this kind of development. So armed with that information and armed with the fact that first we need to understand a little about what a script is before we start putting it in tables like the UI policy or the client script or the business rules or data policy or access controls or all those other places we can put script. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things we run into when we hear people talk about scripting. So to do that, I put together a little kind of starter tool. And as I described that, again, there are many places that will describe this, but essentially when we see JavaScript, we break things down into objects. And those objects may have methods or properties. Really, when we think about it, a great way to note that is that within any one object, there may be another object. And inside that object, another object. And that third object inside might have properties that we want to care about. Or methods, which are little functions or tools that we do stuff with. Now, I use this image from awesomeinventions.com, which is kind of cool. They're Mestroika dolls, but they look like a series of robots. So I just thought it was kind of cute and a funny way to think about JavaScript. When you think about this object having these either other objects inside them, or to either have a little tool inside it, or some component that you want to talk about with that thing. The color is silver. The size is 3 inches tall, or the circumference is 1.72 inches around. Any of those things would be properties of the object. But we may go inside deeper to the next layer of objects and talk about its properties or methods. So when we're dealing with JavaScript, we need to be familiar with the concepts of objects and properties, or methods, which might be functions or tools. Those tools are the pieces that do stuff. Now, when we get to tools, in other words, functionality, then we're talking about doing some piece of work. Usually those tools require directions about the work they're supposed to do. And that's where we get into parameters. So another metaphor that we use oftentimes is the idea of a tool belt. And so different tool belts hold different things, right? If you're wearing a tool belt, there might be a place for a Phillips head screwdriver and a different place for a hammer and a different place for a measuring tape or something like that. That tool belt would be the object, and the holders would be the functions. The directions with what you do with those tools would be the parameters. So in this example that I have here, I might take the object tool belt and use the method Phillips head screwdriver. So I would reach in the tool belt and grab that. And then the parameters would be, three things. Where am I applying it? I'm applying it to the hinge. What direction am I turning? Counterclockwise. How many times do I turn? 3. So those are the parameters for that tool or method that I'm going to apply. Now you can imagine, armed with those pieces, JavaScript could be a very powerful component in a table. If we go back to our architecture diagram, we might see that if I apply JavaScript, for instance, to a client side, in other words, on the browser, I might want to apply certain methods to change the color of a field on the form, or send a message that blinks, or maybe even create data on a different field based on some other field. And to do that, there would be methods to accomplish all of those goals. Now, in the next section, once we've gotten past kind of this super high-level component of things to know about JavaScript for someone who's never touched it before, I'm going to show some examples of some very simple JavaScript components. But really where I'm focused with architecture is talking about where those tools fit and how, as we run through this kind of progression, a user clicks on a menu and that shows them modules. When they click on the module, the system then proceeds down to the core table, in our case the airports table. But before it does that, on its journey, it checks the access control and says, hey, is there anything I have to do? While it's there, it says, hey, is there any JavaScript I have to run? And then it visits the airport table and comes to the business rules table and says, hey, is there anything I have to do? Or maybe are there any JavaScript methods or things I have to do? And so on. So as we take that trip down and then return, we see all of the places that we can use JavaScript, and we see all of the things that we can do with JavaScript. So I'm going to include that in the next section. My goal was to make these really short, so I'm hoping that this will be short enough, but also give kind of an explanation enough that you look forward to the next one, in which I'm going to dive a little bit deeper and show a great way, an example, that we can combine both our very simple airports table with our many-faceted architecture table and put a very tiny little piece of JavaScript to see how the system functions and how that JavaScript might run through all of those places for one single table and one single record. So that's what's coming up. I hope as an explanation of JavaScript, this is a little bit helpful. As I said, for better, deeper explanations, by all means, check some of the other sources out. I definitely recommend the article in the ServiceNow community by Shiva Thomas. I'd also recommend Code Academy, who goes deeper into JavaScript, but understanding where it sits in ServiceNow is an important part. Regardless of how deep you choose to go with scripting, the big thing is understanding this table architecture in terms of I can put my little script or my function in any one of these places. Where do I put it to make the most things happen? So, hope this is helpful. Look forward to the next little bit.